Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Popular Music Books and Process series, a joint project of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music US chapter, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the POP Conference. I'm Elena Razlogova, one of the series organizers, along with Kimberly Mack, Francesca Royster, Eric Weisbird, Carl Wilson, Gus Stadler, and Alex Vizi. You can find our entire calendar on the IASPOM website under the Journal tab. You can also catch up on videos of all our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including a session on musical theater, our last one, with Joanna D. Das, Ryan Donovan, Lisa Gennaro, Jeff McGee, and Liz Wallman. We will be off next 2 weeks, but we'll then return on October 29 with a work in progress on the global phenomenon of Boney M with Masha Salaskina and Elena Razlogova. Today, David Hesmondhalgh, Shuwen Qu, who is Chu Shuwen, who would like to be addressed as Stella, Raquel Campos Valverde, and Zhongwei Mabu Li, who would like to be addressed as Mabu, discuss their collection on music streaming around the world that came out of their MUSICSTREAM project based at the University of Leeds in the UK. David Hesmondhalgh will give a brief overview of the collection and of his chapter on how streaming fits into the long history of capitalism and colonialism in the realm of music. Shuwen Qu will discuss her work on how short video platforms have transformed Chinese music production. Raquel Campos Valverde will discuss her chapter on the problematic implications of the taxonomies used by music streaming platforms. Finally, Zhongwei Li will summarize his history of how platformization has impacted independent Chinese musicians. Let me give you some quick background on today's presenters. David Hesmondhalgh is professor of media, music, and culture at the University of Leeds. His books include Creative Labor, Why Music Matters, and the Cultural Industries. Chu Shuwen is an associate professor at Jinan University and co-investigator on MUSICSTREAM. Her works focus on Chinese music industries and popular music culture, and she is currently working on a monograph on pan-entertainment music streaming in China. Zhongwei Li is a postdoctoral research fellow on the MUSICSTREAM project, based at the University of Leeds. His work focuses mainly on the relationship between music streaming in China and the longer-term history of music, technology, and culture in that country. Raquel Campos Valverde is a postdoctoral research fellow on the MUSICSTREAM project. Her work focuses on software governance and cultural inequality in streaming platforms. She is currently working on a monograph on the ideologies of discovery in music streaming. During this conversation, please post your questions as you think of them on the chat. And in the last part of the session, Eric will call on you to unmute and ask them during the Q&A. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversation. However, we'll ask the presenters to ignore the chat during their discussion. We'll send them a copy of the chat transcript later so they won't miss anything. And now I'm going to turn things over to our presenters.
Thanks, Elena. I'll go first. Thanks to you and your co-organisers for allowing us to speak at in this great series. I hope you can not see my notes. We've got some problems with presenter view, but if you can, well, I'll just have to suffer that embarrassment.
No, we're not seeing them.
That's great. So I'm going to start with some very brief context, which will be familiar to many of you. From around 2010, and especially since 2015, audio streaming has spread across the world. And it mainly operates, of course, via music streaming platforms, which I'll refer to as MSPs from now on. And arguably a new system, a new musical system based around such platforms as developed out of this. Sorry, I've just lost my screen like an idiot. Bear with me. So, can you still see my screen okay? Yeah, great. So, this millions of people, billions of people access music via this new system. And why? There we go. Whether those are Western in origin, such as Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music, or whether they're systems developed in the majority world, such as Ghana in India, or QQ Music in China, Boomplay in much of Africa, and also vitally important are video and social media platforms such as those named there. And of course, music streaming has been controversial, and the controversies and concerns include privacy, surveillance, and unrewarding patterns of use, the difficulties faced by musicians in making a living from recorded music, the blaming of algorithms for reproducing certain power structures, such as those of major record companies, and then all kinds of claims about deterioration in musical experience, such as distracted listening, individualized musical experience, and the sidelining of aesthetic experience by using music for functions such as working out, chilling, and so on. And there have been plenty of claims that music itself has been affected, that it's become bland and unchallenging, that tracks have got shorter, that they're full of gimmicks. And probably the best known journalistic critic of streaming, and in particular Spotify, is Liz Pelly in a series of articles for the Baffler magazine, and more recently in a book that has gained enormous media coverage internationally. There have also been numerous academic critiques of music streaming, perhaps the earliest one, this book by a mainly Swedish team in 2018. And more recently, musicologist Eric Drott has published his Marxian critique. And the Canadian media scholar Rob Prey, based in the UK and Netherlands, has done lots of important critical work on music streaming and platformization. And in previous work, I've tried to push back against some of what I consider to be some of the dubious claims and simplifications in some commentary, while trying to retain an appropriate critique of music streaming. There have been significant efforts to internationalise those debates, such as Ignacio Siles' work on music streaming in Costa Rica. And our book is really an attempt to extend those efforts at internationalisation. And chapters in the book touch on the issues and controversies that I've just listed earlier. But the main focus of the book is to consider a different set of issues and controversies concerning international inequality, and to analyse the effects of streaming on the production, circulation, and consumption of music across nations and continents. And it's become apparent that there's quite a bit of variation in the adoption of streaming around the world, and also in how streaming interacts with existing music industry systems that existed before streaming came along. So how do we account for that international variability? Disparities in wealth are obviously a factor. For example, there's very little streaming available for the vast population of Ethiopia. Yet next door in Kenya, which has around double the GDP per capita of Ethiopia, but is still relatively poor by global standards, a different situation prevails, as Andy Eisenberg shows in his chapter for the book. There in Kenya, a burgeoning industry based on streaming has displaced somewhat the so-called piracy of earlier generations. But wealth is by no means the only factor in that variability I mentioned. As Noriko Manebi shows in her chapter, wealthy Japan was a laggard in the adoption of internet-based music, especially streaming, quote. And Japan was slow because the music industry successfully maintained the popularity of CDs and resisted the onset of platformization. And that shows, I think, that factors specific to individual countries, for example, in that case, the lobbying power of the traditional music industries, are important in understanding variability, though I would just say that, as Noriko points out, even in Japan now, streaming has begun to, as it were, take over and transform music culture in some interesting ways that she outlines. Conversely, some less wealthy countries have seen significant adoption of streaming. For example, as Rodrigo Gomez, Ignacio Gallego, and Ohelia Munoz Laroa show in their chapter on Mexico, Mexico generates 94% of its recorded music revenue from streaming, and more than half of listeners engage regularly with paid music subscription. And the key factor here, and in other Latin American countries with high streaming take-up rates, such as Brazil, a large factor is the adoption of smartphones, but also a culture of spending extensive time on smartphones. And there are also other factors such as the dissemination of credit cards as identification systems. So how do we understand this mix of platformization and variability? What dynamics of capitalism and neo-colonialism might be at work, and how might they be understood and critiqued? In the introduction I've written to the book, I draw on classic cultural imperialism work to try to articulate a set of questions that the introduction then seeks to address. And here they are, there are three of them. First, to what extent is the ownership of the cultural production and distribution of music by Western-based businesses that's been around for decades still apparent? Second, how might this relate to flows of music from the West to the non-West and counterflows from the global South to the minority world? And obviously I'm using different terms here. The terms are contested and complicated, but hopefully we're all clear on pretty much what they mean. And thirdly, to what extent is music and music streaming bound up with modern and often metropolitan practices and habits that originated in the West? And one thing to make clear right from the off is that the collection demonstrates that the spread of streaming undoubtedly involves very problematic conditions for musicians in many countries outside the Anglophone core of the global recorded music industry, even in relatively prosperous or growing countries. And of course, most musicians struggle even in the Anglophone core. But Onur Sisugur, who used to work in the Turkish industry, shows in his chapter how Istanbul musicians have turned to the Turkish advertising industry for work as they face problems in the wake of streaming. Amelia Barner shows how in the semi-peripheral nation of Hungary, there's a very strong influence of the particular geographical policies adopted by platforms, and deals between platforms and royalty collection societies are vital. And in his chapter on Italy, Francesco D'Amato shows that there are intense new promotional battles taking place to achieve visibility via access to playlists. But I think it's important to make clear that this isn't only a matter of streaming. A dual oligopoly now exists, with tech corporations on one side and the recording industry on the other. The latter is dominated by three corporations, all Western, accounting for more than 70% of global music revenues. And there are, of course, also large independent companies operating out to the West that account for quite a bit of the rest. So the ownership picture on the music industry side is still Western dominated. And of course, we can see that Western domination on the IT side of the dual oligopoly as well. Spotify was available in 184 countries and territories in 2024, and it accounts for about a third of all global music streaming revenue. Apple was available in 2020 in about 167 countries. However, in some places, quite a few places, local streaming companies compete with the Western tech companies, such as the Beirut-based streaming service Angami in the Middle East and North Africa region, as discussed in our book by Dorsey Sprengel, and where she also discusses the serious struggles faced by Global South alternative platforms, such as Angami. Often these local competitors developed out of local telecom and mobile phone companies, such as Boomplay in Nigeria, and as discussed by Aditya Lal in his chapter in the book on Ghana and JioSaavn in India. And in some countries, the Western platforms barely exist, most notably China, where Chinese platforms dominate, in particular 3 services operated by the Chinese tech giant Tencent. And streaming in China is particularly interesting, I think. The interaction of the IT sector with the music industry is very different in the Chinese context. And Mabu and Bondy, who's also here tonight, we didn't think he was going to be here, but he's made it. Hi, Bondy. Their chapter unpacks those differences with particular focus on self-releasing Chinese musicians, and Mabu will speak to that shortly. And Stella and Bondy again show the impacts of short video platforms on the Chinese industry, and that's happening in a distinctive way. Again, you'll hear from Stella shortly. So what I'm saying is that there are some complexities surrounding ownership. And if we now return to those 3 key questions I introduced earlier, that second issue, flows of music, there the picture is arguably even more complicated. So one measure of such flows is the proportion of locally consumed content that's also locally produced. And another is how the extent to which non-Western music achieves an impact in the West. And of course, Western markets are typically the most prestigious and lucrative markets. And Bad Bunny there, Senor Bunny, is obviously a key example of that. In some respects, international music flows in the age of streaming still show signs of the kinds of cultural domination associated with Cold War neocolonialism. And for example, the USA still accounts for significant portions of the most popular tracks and the most popular artists in many countries and across many genres. So Taylor, Beyonce, etc. And as Raquel shows in her chapter in the book, and as she'll discuss shortly, datafied and automated music streaming depends on opaque taxonomic systems which potentially encode Western biases into international music culture. However, data suggests that preferences for local content have increased in the streaming era. So, for example, in a whole range of countries, just to give 3 examples fairly randomly, Italy, Poland and Brazil, the most popular content in those countries is overwhelmingly Italian, Polish and Brazilian, respectively. And we're seeing the rising popularity of domestic genres, such as Gengetone in Kenya, as Andy Eisenberg discusses in his chapter. We're seeing that in many countries across the world. And we seem to be seeing a waning international dominance of Anglophone music. And As is familiar, I think, to many of you, a number of genres have thrived internationally over the last 10 years, the era of the dominance of streaming. Among them, the Latin pop, discussed by Gomez, Gallego and Munoz in their chapter on Mexico. K-pop, though, of course, K-pop is felt by many Asian commentators to be rather Western, so, that's a disputed territory. Significant numbers of African artists are achieving global success for the first time, and the umbrella term Afrobeats is used for a range of musical styles where that's happening. And nearly a quarter of all Spotify streams, are music that it categorises as hip hop, and it's hard to see hip hop as representing straightforwardly a case of cultural imperialism, given that it emanates from an oppressed and marginalised population within the West. So can these developments be understood as contemporary equivalents of what Michael Denning, in his wonderful book on the noise uprising, as he calls it, of the 1920s recorded music industry, what he calls vernacular phonograph musics? Can we think of Afrobeats and hip-hop variants as representing what he calls a decolonisation of the ear, associated with son and rumba and samba and tango, jazz and calypso and so on in the 1920s? Whether or not such claims can be sustained, the increasing emphasis on local content and the declining importance of English language music, and the rise of genres not easily associated with the white Anglo-imperial centre of the music industries, surely complicate any effort to see streaming as just a digital version of cultural imperialism or colonialism. But to end, what about that third key question I raised earlier concerning the spread of Western cultural practices and habits, musical practices and habits? In my chapter, the introductory chapter to the book, I explore the global spread of the supermarket as an offline analogy for the spread of music streaming. In spite of the variability I mentioned earlier, there is a commonality in that the new music system is centred on abundance and on convenience and relative cheapness in the same way that supermarkets are. And music streaming platforms offer goods that are very similar to those offered by other MSPs, as is the case with supermarkets. And MSPs present products to their customers in strikingly similar ways to each other, as is the case with supermarkets, where the aisles tend to have the same names between different supermarkets and so on. And I think that it's hard to imagine other ways of categorising food and drink in a retail environment other than those conveyed by supermarkets. It's testament to the cultural hegemony of the supermarket as an economic and a cultural institution. And I think MSPs, like supermarkets, now frame the possibilities of musical experience in a particular set of ways that are coming to seem natural, and where abundance, convenience and relative cheapness are at the core. And these are fundamentally Western values based on Western notions of time and space. Obviously, there are differences. Supermarkets remain mainly offline, and MSPs are personalised in a way that offline supermarkets aren't. But I think the analogy can be enlightening. In both domains, a dominant sameness closes down alternatives, and alternative forms of consumption come to seem inconvenient, an option that requires particular levels of ethical commitment. So I think the spread of streaming doesn't represent colonial homogenization at the level of music itself. Rather, it extends the problematic abundance associated with capitalism, with modernization, industrialization. And if there is homogenization, it's evident more in the way in which MSPs, maybe like supermarkets, embody Western notions of flourishing via abundance and convenience. And okay, I'm going to finish there and I'll hand over to Stella.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Thank you, Elena, for having us here. Okay, I will share my screen now. Okay, can you see my PPT?
Yes.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. Today I want to talk about this chapter co-authored with my colleague Bondy, entitled Charting Anonymous Hits, How Short Video Platforms Have Changed the Chinese Music Industries. First, let's check out this really famous Chinese Douyin hit in 2018, Learning to Meow. Okay, as you can see, the song has really catchy and simple melody and is matched with this cute dance and hand moves. Actually, the song sounds really simple, but it's not simple at all. It marks the beginning of the national explosion of short video hits in China. In this talk, we will discuss this tremendous impacts of Douyin hits from the following two aspects. First, we argue Douyin has taken over China's digital music ecosystem, diverting users' money and attention away from music streaming platforms. Second, Douyin produce anonymous hits. Audience usually remember the names of the song rather than artist's name. Artists seem to be disappearing in hits production. So to address Douyin's great institutional and cultural impacts, we propose the concept of curatorial optimization. This concept is built on praise curatorial power and Morris the culture of optimization. Prey argues that streaming platforms can shape what music gets heard, but the power isn't absolute. It is still subject to the competing interests of three markets: music, finance, and advertising. Similarly, Morris showed that though artists, labels, and playlist promoters respond by optimizing content for visibility, there are still definitional gaps among stakeholders regarding what counts as acceptable or unacceptable optimization. So this point is nicely captured in this article recently published. It shows a song's optimization in the West is still a contingent, negotiated social process. However, in China, we think Douyin, together with its promotional industry partners, reduce these definitional gaps, enabling Douyin to become the giant magnet that aligns the different stakeholders' interests and drives the production of Douyin-optimized hits. Now let's see how Douyin reshaped Chinese music ecosystem. In the West, while streaming platforms have influenced listening, the stream majors still take control. Yet in China, this structure is reversed. In China, platforms dominate. To be more specific, TME dominates. TME dominates over 70% of music copyright, acting as both distributor and rights owner. To make an analogy like this, you can imagine Spotify and the big three merge into one company in the West. So in this Chinese oligarchic structure, small competitors like NetEase Cloud Music and short video platforms have found a way to fight back against TME oligarchy. Around 2015, music streaming platforms like NetEase Cloud have launched self-releasing musician schemes to cut copyright costs and cultivate promising artists. But in 2018, Douyin entered the game. By producing 15-second audiovisual emotionally charged hits, Douyin not only diverted attention and traffic greatly from music streaming platforms, but also even pushed TME and NCM to follow the rule and to confirm music production according to Douyin logic. So in this sense, Douyin doesn't just compete. Douyin has disrupted Chinese TME oligarchy and reshaped the logic of music making across the entire ecosystem. So this is how the Chinese music ecosystem now look like, as you can see in the picture. Douyin sits in the center of the network, competing with TME and NCM, but Douyin has attained greater leverage to push other music streaming platforms to follow and establish their in-house studio. And you can see here, those are the in-house studios of the platforms to adapt to this Douyin hit production logic. But the question is, how does Douyin challenge the power structure so successfully through hits production? We identify a three-step curatorial optimization mechanism: monitoring charts, stocking indexes, and depersonalizing audiovisuals. We will explain one by one. So the whole mechanism is based on the chart. The first step is monitoring charts, and it is based in the chart politics. And this politics operate among three charts as you can show here. So the hit studio will first identify promising seed song on Douyin viral chart, and then it keep monitoring the seed's data performance in the music streaming platform's viral chart, and finally confirm the seed success on both Douyin viral chart and the music platform's top chart. And in the next mechanism, this is the most important and most expensive mechanism. Once a seed song is identified, studios will invest heavily into promotion of that song, up to 90% of the budget. Production only counts 10%. So they will pay Douyin influencers and accounts across content categories to feature the song as their BGM. So they also use backend data analytics to track listeners' behavior, engagement, as you can see, and their social trends in real time to calculate when and how they will invest the next round of promotion investment. So this number-driven stocking approach treats songs as financial assets, emphasizing their metric value over artistic identity. So the third mechanism is depersonalizing audiovisuals. While the first two steps promote existing songs, this step optimizes original songs from the songwriting to performance. So the hit song will mine user comments under the song in a common zone, and they will pick the trending topics and the even to produce concrete positive lyrics that fit short video trends in dancing challenges and e-commerce contents. They also select internet contagious vocals to maximize emotional impact, further stripping away the artistic identity and turn music into a depersonalized vehicle for traffic and commercial interest. So in conclusion, we argue that Douyin exemplifies the power of curatorial optimization in a platform-dominated ecosystem. By aligning or even flattening stakeholders' interests, steering hit producers, and depersonalizing music, Douyin reshapes not only ecosystem structure, but also the logic of music making in the trends of anonymity. And we have three further thoughts to share. First, we'd like to emphasize the importance of cross-platform dynamics instead of only focusing on the relationship between music labels and music platforms. And second takeaway is we want to emphasize the power of charts. Even though the Chinese platforms' charting power seem a little bit extreme in our case, but the curatorial power of charts deserve more attention globally. Osborne notes that traditional charts like Billboard or UK top charts were once negotiated by retailers, labels, and BBC and radio broadcast. Today, Spotify and YouTube, they have their own charts like top, weekly chart, daily chart, and viral chart in their chart system. But interestingly, Spotify, they underrate or marginalize traditional charts and Billboard. You won't see them unless you search their name. So though TikTok right now hasn't displayed their charts, we think it deserves further attention to see how YouTube music charts, vibrate with other charts across a whole platform ecosystem and to see what institutional and cultural impacts will be. So the third question concerned the disappearing artist. We show that Douyin prioritized traffic and the song's copyright revenue over personal creativity and artistic identity. But this isn't just happening in China. Spotify also promotes mood-based and AI-generated songs, often use pseudonyms or fake artist name, so that in a sense is also anonymous. So this also turned music into a background content rather than the artist-oriented work of art. So these are the few further thoughts we can discuss later. Okay, thank you for your time and listening. I will now hand over to Raquel.
Thank you, Stella.
Okay, please. Okay, I'll quit. Okay.
Thank you. Can you all see the slides rather than the presenter view?
Yes.
Thank you. So thank you, Stella, and thank you to the host for this invitation. I'm going to present my chapter in this edited collection, which is entitled Inequity by Design, Music Streaming Taxonomies as Ruinous Infrastructure. The idea for this chapter came to me shortly after we published our team-authored literature review on algorithmic recommender systems and the questions about diversity and equality that remained unanswered in that literature review. I was also inspired by previous contributions such as Nick Siever's research on the corporate cultures of music recommendation software developers and the work of Safiya Noble on algorithmic racial bias. My idea was to try to bridge these two fields or these two areas of research and understand how music recommendation may be biased in its software infrastructure. My interest in this area also comes from the historical context. The research for this chapter took place at the end of a period of increased gender and racial conflict visibility that heavily influenced the music industry discourse. In line with the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement, anti-Black racism was heavily used in music industry statements at the time when we were starting this project in 2022. And they often use this language of structural racism and bias. So I wanted to test if their statements really match practical action in terms of how they were reforming the music recommender infrastructure. I did this by focusing on the concept of taxonomy, which means the classification systems, the tags, the conceptual maps of genre, instruments, rhythm, and so on, that are used to organize content in music streaming platforms and feed music files into algorithmic systems. I wanted to continue Nick Siever's work and Noble's work and research the kind of cultural visions embedded in these taxonomies and whether they were having an impact on music culture or reproducing any further bias. I looked at taxonomies from three perspectives: as a music industry practice, as an element of the software coding, and as an underlying infrastructure of music recommendation products such as the playlist that we see in streaming platforms. In terms of industry practice, the chapter outlines how music taxonomies go through three stages where they are created or modified in this kind of hourglass of data that you can see here. First, the creators and the labels organize their productions according to their own taxonomies. And at this stage, they may also request the help of a tagging service, which automatizes this process. Second, this taxonomical data is then made DDEX compliant. The Digital Data Exchange is an industry-funded ombudsman that oversees the standards for how data circulates between all interested parties in the industry. However, this compliance exercise reduces the richness of the data, as I will explain in a minute. And third, in the bottom of this slide, the MSPs and their internal data scientists and curators organize these taxonomies and tags according to their commercial interest or their internal standards before music recommendations are released to the public. The truth is that in an industry, as an industry protocol and as a software coding standard, the DDEX taxonomies are quite poor and biased towards mainstream Western music. I invite you all to browse this website and have a look at how the categories are organized. For example, there are 45 subcategories of rock in this taxonomy, but a big area such as Latin only has 14 subgenres, I think, at the moment. There are also blatant omissions, such as the way, for example, that the Indian subcontinent is treated almost as if it was a monolithic entity. When the industry uses automated tagging services, things do not really improve. The taxonomies available are again Western and mainstream centric, and the music information retrieval and AI technologies used for these kinds of automated tools do not really have the training data to go beyond Western music, instrumentation, or sound. In a way, it's not surprising when you think about it. This is what you get when you don't hire ethnomusicologists. But jokes aside, I think we can agree that it is a stark contrast with the equality and anti-racist promises that we have seen earlier and what they are actually doing. The saddest thing is that these taxonomies do not even hold up when you compare them with the efforts of fans and aficionados in many music scenes that could provide much more complex data networks if they were involved in these designs. Not to mention, of course, how much better these taxonomies would be if public institutions such as the Library of Congress or the British Library were at least consulted, if not directly involved in these designs. I think it's clear that these music streaming corporations do not really have a public service goal in mind. So these kind of community-centric options are not even considered. But there's also a lot to say about how the neoliberal defunding of public institutions often comes hand in hand with letting a private company to deliver this service, in this case, music data libraries, even when they are clearly not very good at it. However, streaming platforms often use curatorial expertise in marketing materials and in PR statements, but the underlying software infrastructure does not seem fit for purpose to deliver such promised expertise. If we look at the final recommender products, there's indeed a distinct Western bias to almost tragicomic effects, I would say. Even leaving aside the poor software infrastructure, if any of these companies had reasonable curatorial expertise, many of their current products wouldn't even exist, let alone be recommended to people. But I'm sure you can imagine being someone from Spain or Mexico and being recommended one of these playlists. Clearly, their target customer is someone else. It's someone in North America or in Northwestern Europe that wants to explore some more or less exotic content. This has come to the fore even more between 2023 and now with the developments at Spotify. In late 2023, Spotify laid off their head data scientist, Glenn MacDonald, that had been developing an organic network of genres as a new experiment on organizing taxonomies, which eventually culminated in a new product, Spotify Daylist, with a rather strange genre categories that you can see some examples there. These taxonomies later reappeared in their end-of-the-year compilation, Spotify Wrapped, leaving also a lot of customers puzzled about where these new genre categories came from and things they knew nothing about. And then after the departure of MacDonald, these taxonomies started to look also increasingly AI generated, which again shows how much the influence of a single employee can have on these classification systems that are encoded in the recommendation software. The conclusion to all this is that either as an industry practice, as an element of software coding, or as the underlying infrastructure of music recommendation products. There doesn't seem to be a clear strategy in the industry, let alone a real commitment to dismantle algorithmic bias. And I approach this from the anthropological lens of ruinous infrastructures, not understood in terms of decadence, but as those infrastructures that promise something for the future that they don't really deliver. Yes, I'm going to stop that in the interest of time, but thank you, and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to hand over to Mabu now. Thank you.
Thanks, Raquel. Hi, everyone. My name is Mabu. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not using any slides, so don't panic. I'm going to talk about my co-authored chapter with my colleague Bondy. It's titled Independent Music Creators and Self-Releasing in China, the History of Platformization. This chapter was a result of my fieldwork in China in 2023 and 2024. So as part of the MUSICSTREAM project, I spent almost a year in China. And this chapter focuses on one particular track of research I did while I was there, which is about the focus groups with independent music creators. So what we did was we started recruiting music creators to participate in focus groups. We did 7 of those, each consisting of 5 to 6 musicians. And we grouped these musicians into focus groups by genre. So we had a indie rock group, we had a urban R&B group, had a metal group, and even a experimental music group, among others. So our participants are what can be generally termed independent music creators. So it's quite a different cultural world with the one Stella just depicted, which revolves around viral hits. So in our chapter, we give a brief history of independent music distribution in China, which is under the subtitle From Underground to Self-Releasing. So let's start from there. To put it really briefly, the People's Republic of China has a tradition of alternative music making that is closely associated with ideas and ideals of cultural independence, which we could argue started from the politically turbulent times of the late 1980s. And around the turn of the century and before the age of the internet, the so-called underground musicians in China used cassette tapes and CDRs to release and spread their work. Much like during the heyday of indie in the West, there were also local networks of alternative music distributions in mostly urban China, and those networks operated around keynotes such as independent labels and micro labels, rock magazines and fanzines and bookstores, record stores, and so on. And then when we entered the 2000s, we started to see websites that provided digital self-releasing services for music creators. Among these websites, the most influential ones were a couple of tech startups, including one is called Xincha, New Cha, which was started in 2006 by a group of Shanghai-based artists and entrepreneurs. And the other one is Douban, which is founded in 2005 by a Beijing-based programmer, initially as a one-person project. And in a way, you can see Niucha and Douban as some Chinese versions of MySpace and the like. So that was a time when Chinese musicians, which includes the older generation of underground musicians, as well as a newer generation of indie musicians, started using digital tools to release their music online. Today, however, websites like Niucha and Douban have largely been replaced by streaming platforms such as QQ Music and NetEase Cloud Music, which Stella mentioned in her talk, and these platforms provide very similar functions. They're open to independent creators to upload and release their music on the platform through what is often termed 原创音乐人服 original musician services. So in this research, we are interested in how independent musicians in China cope with this turn of page from the early internet to platformization. So what are their experiences of platformization? How does this transformation have an impact on their work life? And what does it mean to them as an independent musician in China? These are our core questions. I should also add that if you read the chapter, you see that we also try to argue that behind this change, there are also more structural transformations, such as what we call datafication, corporatization, and infrastructural enclosure, which I don't really have the time to fully unpack here, but I'd be more than happy to discuss in the Q&A. So in the chapter, we discussed quite a few of our findings actually, but I'm only going to focus on one of them today. So in those focus groups, one of the first things we often asked the musicians was, what do you really need from a digital platform? And the responses we got was almost a shared voice that although gaining a significant income from streaming is not quite a viable thing, it is also not the most important thing if you're an independent musician. So many of our participants explicitly said that they understood self-releasing more in terms of sharing or display rather than as a process of selling or trade. This distinction sits on the very classic debate between the creative value and the commercial value of music. And from an old-fashioned Marxist perspective, we could even say that this idea points to a kind of a musical labor that is not so alienated from creators themselves. So at a certain stage, we could say that early digital music websites such as Douban and Nucha generated some potential to achieve such aspirations. However, following the rapid state-driven institutionalization of copyright in China, the mid-2010s witnessed a very aggressive copyright war as music streaming platforms competed to bid for exclusive licensing deals with major rights holders. As a result, we see a new formalized music streaming sector which integrated the Chinese platform economy with the interests of local and international music industries took form. So as a result, calculating, collecting, and distributing streaming revenues became a top priority for today's streaming platforms. And this new system, with its streamlined digital rights management mechanisms, is far better equipped to cater to these needs than earlier website or web portal-based configurations. So this process of formalization was also reflected in the other very common scenario in which a musician found the tracks they had uploaded to a streaming platform very difficult to be taken down, unlike the case on early websites like Douban, which allowed them to remove any content as they wished. So one of our participants said, on NetEase Cloud, you can't upload a song and delete it as you wish. So music seems to have become something like their products or assets. You have no choice. So in the early period of digitalization, self-releasing services were more like informal means of music distribution that were only very loosely associated with copyright enforcement in China. After 2015, the new platforms that survived that copyright war have locked themselves into exclusive licensing deals with major rights owners, became very solidly embedded in a new regime of internet governance with copyright protection at its core, which is marked by the Internet Plus strategy launched by the government in 2015. So in a way, works of musicians have become the assets controlled by the platforms. And in this way, we see that music creators being pushed into new spheres of datafied relations while simultaneously alienating them from the works they created. For some independent musicians, however, the will to resist that very form of alienation was the reason why they identified with the politics of indie in the first place. So we see that independent music creators encounter unexpected difficulties as they adapt to the norms and rules of a new musical system. And these new rules, which is conditioned by a copyright-centric, platform-based ecosystem, are designed to meet the needs of powerful players who now have a stake in digital music publishing, namely large rights owners from the mainstream music industries. So in other words, independent musicians have been forced to adapt to a new set of tools serving the interests of the majors in place of an old set of tools once used to circumvent them. So in a way, we see that the historical wheel has turned full circle. That's the end of my presentation. Thanks. And I guess I hand this back to our host.
By host, do you mean me or Dave or both? Or is the plan to now go directly to Q&A?
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you all had questions for each other, but I'm sure in the interest of time.
We ask each other questions all the time, Eric.
That's fair. That's totally fair. All right. So we'll start with individual questions for each presenter and then see where things lead. John, did you want to ask your question of Dave?
Sure. Thanks everybody for the presentations. They're great. So Dave, did you come up with analogies other than the supermarket analogy? And if so, why did you decide not to use them? Like what were the pros and cons of each?
No, I didn't, John, but I probably should have done, shouldn't I? Now I think about it. Now you mention it, I mean, yeah, it would be very interesting to think about other elements of life that have spread from the West to the non-West. I guess one might think about automobiles or televisions or something, but supermarkets seemed apt because of the connection. The connection in my mind was abundance and convenience. I think that and that sense that we will have access without interfering too much with our life. So they seem to embody a kind of accelerated, time-hungry way of living. And so obviously that raises questions about Western consumerism, capitalism and colonialism being linked in that, and questions about whether we're really pursuing well-being in living those kinds of lives. I guess those are the concerns that are at the heart of what I was trying to suggest. Might be a more robust foundation for critique than the simply incorrect idea that these Western technologies are leading to a greater hegemony of the Western music core, because the evidence seems to suggest that that's not really the case. So yeah, those are some thoughts. That's a really interesting question, and I'll definitely start thinking of some other analogies.
Food is maybe the least streamable thing in our lives at the moment. I'm not positive about that assertion. I'm just, it's not nearly as late for me as it is for you. So, okay. Chris Malamphy, question.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for all the great papers. I wanted to ask a question about the paper on Douyin and the Chinese charts, because that fascinated me. I get a question a lot when I'm asked about the charts, where people say, do the charts even matter anymore? Aren't they more affected by fandoms, that sort of thing? And I say, if anything, the charts mean more than ever because fans are following them more avidly than ever. So, given the premises of your paper, do you feel that the charts are more avidly followed almost as a sport in China the way I feel they are in America, particularly given, the involvement and the effect of short video on chart fandom, that sort of thing?
Thank you, Chris. This is really a fascinating question, and I think right now the charts politics is very different from the U.S. and it's also
Sure.
very different from the previous period. I will first talk about the difference, and then I'll also talk about the similarities of the previous stage and the current stage. I think now the first difference is the fandom culture. The fans chase the charts because they care the artist. But now the charting politics that we show here is they don't care about the artist.
Right.
What they care is the songs popularity, the singles, the songs popularity. That's why we say it's becoming anonymous. That worries us. This is the first difference. The second difference is, if previous stage people chase artists, it's from the fandom level, that is from the fans, it's micro level. But now in China, it is industrial level. As you can see in that ecosystem, not only Douyin lead the whole game, the music platforms, TME and NetEase Cloud, they follow suit. And then they have their in-house viral studios, and then they even outsource some of the viral productions to other small studios. So you can imagine the whole national music ecosystem is restructured towards this Douyin-centric logic. So these are the two major differences. And the second, and the similarities is also very interesting. No matter in US or in China, I think the charts still function to is still based on this data logic. I remember a case in 2018. Chinese fans have gamified the iTunes charts. They buy a lot of votes for Chris Wu. And so all of a sudden, Chris Wu have many songs topping the charts, the iTunes charts. So the second artist, Ariana Grande, and she said, is this chart justified? If people can gamify the chart, can we trust the iTunes charts? So I think the similarity is the fandom also play on data, and now Chinese curatorial optimization also play on data to gamify the system, to redefine the power of charts. But this brings the question is of the justice of charts, why it matter, and how, and whether it is still function as a justified system for us to understand the public value of music. So this question still lingers, Yeah.
Thank you. That's really enlightening. And that difference between fandom for an artist versus fandom for a song is a really rich topic. It's one that has been very much on my mind lately, and your context is very helpful. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Elena, I think you have a question for Raquel.
Yes, I do. Hi, Raquel. Thank you so much for your presentation. We actually had Glenn MacDonald on this book series, and it was interesting to see to hear your presentation in relation to his. I was interested in your slide of grassroots produced genre classifications. And I've interviewed some independent radio DJs, and they actually use Spotify to get kind of to search for new music. But what they do, they search for user-generated playlists. And according to them, they can find very obscure music that way. And I wonder, has there been any attempt by users to incorporate these grassroots produced genres into the streaming platforms? Maybe via user-generated playlist names or some other ways. And I wonder if you found that fans of these subgenres could find each other within the SMPs. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, for that question. Yes, indeed. User-generated content still exists on Spotify, and yeah, users and fans can use the search function to look for similar things and maybe find subgenres that are sort of adjacent to what they already listen to, and follow other people that have similar tastes and so on. But at the same time, as you know, for Spotify and for other platforms as well, user-generated content is now less prominent on the interface. It's not as easy to find as it was in the past, where the recommendation that you would get would often have user-generated playlists. And now you kind of get the opposite, in which most of it is sort of official or corporate-owned playlist, and then you have the user-generated content at the end. And so it's less prominent. And I think, yes, that MacDonald used user-generated content also to feed the data that he was using in Every Noise at Once. So in that sense, the user-generated content is also feeding how those taxonomies are created, and therefore how the product is designed. But as far as I understand, MacDonald was also using those taxonomies as marketing tools to see if he could create new genres and make something happen that he thought was going to be something in the future. So it's a mix of, a classification endeavor and a marketing endeavor of trying to make these things happen. So in that sense, I guess, of course, if you're not a librarian, you're not interested in just having a classification system for the sake of it, I guess. So it's a different objective if you work for a private company. And for users, perhaps this is easier because they can sort of find each other with the search function. But we also need to think that for user-generated content, we can find all kinds of user-generated content. So it could be extremist user-generated content. So whether that is a good idea, that user-generated content is easy to find or it can be incorporated into the platform, it's questionable as well. User-generated content can also be perhaps something that shouldn't be displayed that much, depending on where it comes from. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'll aim a question at Mabu first and Dave by extension. I'm interested in music produced for a domestic market versus music produced for export. So in the case of China, how is that balance struck? And in particular, for Mabu and Dave, are there indie artists producing music for export rather than domestic consumption? And how do these kinds of factors of whether the music's understood to be aimed at a primarily national audience or an international audience affect things in the era of streaming?
Thanks, Eric. That's a really thoughtful question, and I think I can't really give you a very comprehensive picture of that, because I think the value of that very question is that it tackles the sort of multi-dimensional sort of stratification of the world of music production and distribution, and it is really our research interest to unpack this sort of intersection between this two mechanisms of stratification. But I guess to briefly answer your question, I guess even in the age of early internet in China, there are always, I guess, independent music genres that are produced, I guess, more suitable for a Western audience. For example, what we would consider as avant-garde music or experimental music. But then there are also other types of independently produced music, such as the more singer-songwriter types, more what we call folk music that would primarily targets the local audience. And then eventually, as the ecosystem for music distribution has changed, it has been platformized. We see well, I have witnessed, I guess, more of a divergence of the ways in which there's different kinds of music circulates and travels and reach their audiences. And for example, you see the more and more marginalized experimental musicians, they tend to use Bandcamp services to release their music. But then at some point, I think 5 or 6 years ago, Bandcamp was actually banned in China. So now they had to really do a lot more extra work to do that. While the other kinds, musicians who were producing, for example, Chinese folk music or singer-songwriter types of music, some of them are actually managed to make a career on Douyin or other short video platforms, and really becoming different kinds of creators and participate and generate different kinds of cultural scenes. So that is really fascinating, and I'm glad you asked this question. Thanks.
Sure. And Dave, I don't know if you had, as editor of the book, any sort of thoughts about this question of domestic markets versus export music and streaming.
Yeah. One thought, well, a number of thoughts, Eric, but just to say briefly now, in terms of the themes of inequality and, if you like, international justice that are at the heart of the volume, I guess the chapter by Amelia Barner on Hungary is very interesting because one of the things that Amelia brings out there is how very, very difficult it is for Hungarian artists to reach export markets in the terms we're using, to reach international audiences compared with musicians from other countries. And of course, that's a long-standing inequality in music. But I guess there might be an illusion or a delusion that streaming, because in principle, of course, the international audiences can access your music very easily, it might seem as though there's an equalization in that respect. That the kind of instances I was giving of cases where, if you like, non-Western musics have achieved unprecedented success in the West, which I think most of us would see as a positive development. That's only certain instances. There are many, many musicians working in what we might call countries peripheral to the global recorded music system, where that's extremely difficult, and that seems to me to be an important dimension of inequality. So I'll just say that for now, and thanks for your question.
All right. We may have had a slight etiquette breach where a question was answered in the comments against all warnings, but in the interests of posterity, I'm going to ask if Rob Drew would re-ask his question of Stella.
Okay, I didn't see the answer to my question, but it had to do with you talk about, Stella, how the videos in this Douyin platform, the background music is very anonymous, and I wonder if that's just become, or has the potential to become, just a forum for AI. I think there's resistance to that in the US. I know that, I don't know well, but I know a lot of TikTok videos have real artists with real music in the background who have sold some concert tickets as a result. Is this anonymization of the background music for this platform just a backdoor for a lot of AI music potentially? Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. First of all, it's really nice to meet you here. Your karaoke work inspired me a lot. Yeah, and thank you for this question. I would say definitely. I think it's like a preparation almost, or it's like a trial for the upcoming, for the flooding, I would say, of the AI music production in China. And obviously, AI music production has already starting really fast here. A lot of startup companies are investing that. But you ask about the attitude of the industry. I would say it's the same. The industry players in general welcome the AI music as it save money, but musicians, they are more reserved. On the one hand, they use them to try new sound and ideas, but at the same time, they fear they will lose the job because of AI. Some of them even express that boldly in industry conferences. So the atmosphere is really tensioned, I would say. Yeah. But definitely, I think these anonymous hits is closely related to this AI generated production. That's why I point that point in my last slide. The disappearing artist is the logic is very similar. That is, use computational language, use data and metric power to produce music, and the artists are disappearing. Individual artists are disappearing in the whole process. Yeah. Thank you, Rob. Yeah.
All right. Just a couple more questions. To kill two birds with one stone, our next question is going to come from Masha Salaskina, who I should point out will be presenting next in the series along with Usha Iyer on the global phenomenon of Boney M, a work in progress. So that seems like a brilliant segue. But Masha, ask your question, please.
Thank you. Thank you for these wonderful presentations. And my question is very big, so and it's for everyone. I'm really wondering about the framing of these streaming services in relation to specifically cultural colonialism. And in fact, David, you say in your introduction, not imperialism, for example. And I'm wondering whether the models or kind of the questions of global and local inequalities in this case has two aspects, and one really has to do with strictly capitalist neoliberal structures that both reproduce and generate new forms of precarity and inequality, and then the more culturally focused West versus the rest kind of colonial structures. And of course, as Raquel's presentation really demonstrated, very often these issues of racialization and colonial legacies are reproduced within the strictly economic, let's say, structures. But I wonder if there are times where there are divergences among them, because, for example, the emergence of local actors among these streaming platforms is in no way a guarantee of either a more equal or a more just or less precarious form of relationship to music. And I'm wondering in this respect whether the different platforms maybe offer at least different kind of sets of relationships between these questions. Let's put it sort of very bluntly, economics versus cultural colonialism, or capitalism versus cultural colonialism. And whether you see either in any of your own work or in the some of the works within the collection that, again, sometimes overlaps, sometimes tensions or divergences can be seen.
Would everybody mind if I just had a first pass at that and maybe give others time to think a little more? Masha, I think you raised some really important things there. And a short answer is to say that I agree very strongly with an element of what I think you're saying there, which is that in itself, the presence of non-Western platforms is no guarantee of anything emancipatory or progressive, nor is in itself the presence on the international stage of music emanating from the non-West. Though I think it's possible to see diversity itself as some sort of good. When we compare what we have now with the really very, very significant domination of Anglo-American repertoire from the 50s to the 80s, and compare that with what Michael Denning in that book I was discussing presents convincingly in many ways as a rather golden period of international circulation of recorded music in the 20s and 30s. I think that there's some hope in there, but you're absolutely right. There's we mustn't in any way rush to celebrate what's going on. One thing I would just say in terms of that distinction you're drawing between, if you like, the capitalist and the colonialist dynamics here, I would see them both as each of them as both economic and cultural. It's not like the capitalist stuff is economic and the colonialist dynamics are cultural. I would see them both as economic and cultural all the way through. But that's a minor point. I think you're absolutely right to say to push back against any sense that something emanating from the non-West, from the global South, is in itself a challenge to the global system. And a number of the chapters are very clear on that. For example, Darcy Sprengel's chapter on Angami, the streaming service that started in Beirut, that's fairly popular in the Middle East and North Africa region. There are real problems there. They reproduce a lot of the problems that we see in the greater international streaming economy. So thanks very much for your question. I don't know if any of the others want to come back on any aspects of that.
Speak now.
Well, I'll just add a very, very minor, I guess, self-promotion. I mean, at first, thanks for asking this question, and it's really, these big questions are really important. I guess in our work dealing with the case in China, itself is a way to answer this question. I think you've actually put it, very neatly in asking that question, that, the case of China is a case in which tells us that we can't just use this very, reductive kind of critical frameworks to make a judgment about what happened historically. Yeah, I mean, my self-promotion is just that we didn't actually write about infrastructure in this book, but earlier I had a co-authored article with Dave that deals with infrastructure about music distribution in China, which is called From P2P to the Cloud. So very, very much like, the way that you asked this question, we kind of try to compare the trajectory in China of how, we arrived at this streaming platforms from the early internet with the sort of a narrative of Spotification, how we have P2P and then we have Spotify eventually. So our kind of findings is that although because of various reasons, we have the Great Firewall, we have this very protectionist policies, we have copyright environment that neither Google or Apple or Spotify entered China successfully. We still had some Chinese version of Spotify and Spotification that eventually converged with the sort of tendency in the West, and we see the loss of openness and generativity in the media infrastructure of the music streaming. So yeah, there are overlaps and divergences that in the Chinese case, and yeah.
Cool. All right, one last question for tonight, and then we need to let these folks from all over the world get to bed. Fairuza.
Hi, everyone. Sorry to be the last question holding everyone back from freedom. I really enjoyed the talks. I'm writing a thesis. I'm a master's student writing about streaming, specifically streaming interfaces. So it was really interesting to me. I have a question specifically for Raquel, but I think it could be interesting for everyone or anyone who wants to answer about adding on to Elena's question about user-generated content on platforms, and specifically about taxonomy versus maybe like folksonomy or bottom-up structures of kind of decision-making in platform design. I was just wondering if anyone is finding anything about interface design in classification systems, indexing, archives, streaming platforms, etc., that's impacting the types of music that is valued or the way that people interact with music. So specifically just about these interface features.
I'm not sure if I understand the question though. Do you mean if the interfaces have incorporated something that was user generated, then is that?
It's more so about if I guess user generated content as being one part of the thing that is incorporated into interfaces, but interfaces in general, maybe I'm thinking about like streaming platforms specifically, the difference between Spotify versus Apple Music versus some of these other newer platforms that are propping up, or international platforms, can seem minute, but the interface decisions and the interface design can actually have large impacts on the ways we value music and the ways we interact with music, is more so what I'm thinking.
Well, I think I don't have the information to respond to that question. What I can say is Apple is definitely an odd one in that sense. Apple, for example, does not follow the DDEX standard. They never had, and they don't want to. So to start with, the taxonomies that they use are specifically generated by them. And they don't want to follow the international standards, but they see that as a product differentiation that makes them different from anyone else. And if you're using multiple platforms, you will see that the recommendations on Apple are quite different from what you would get on Spotify, for example. But specifically about user-generated content, I'm not sure I have anything valuable to say. I think one important thing is that most platforms will eventually, or will try eventually, to mirror whatever is popular, in this case, vertical video content, it seems, and Spotify tried so. But I don't have anything very illuminating to say about it, sorry.
Could I just say briefly, Eric, Firuza, I think, I'm thrilled to hear that you're investigating into interfaces. It seemed, I mean, you might have seen that 4 of us from the team wrote an article on music streaming platform interfaces, and our argument was about the homogeneity of them, the striking similarities between the 7 main services that existed in the UK at the time we were doing our analysis in 23, and but we didn't look at that issue that you're raising. So that sounds like a really great issue to be investigating, and I'd really love to see the fruits of your labour in that respect.
All right, the top of the hour approaches, so I think I'm going to thank all the contributors to music streaming around the world for being with us here, and I'm not sure if it was underlined before, but I'll underline it. It's an open access book, so wait a few days and check it out, everybody. I can say it with no guilt. And we'll see you next time on Popular Music Books in Process. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, especially the organizers.
Thank you. So it's October 29th for Masha Salaskina and Usha Yer on Bonnie M. Book in Progress. Thank you.